Admiral Mullen started off actually by asking, when he described his experience with John Stewart last night, asking the question that occurred to me about trying to do this gig that Rob asked me to do is, why in the world would you do this? The short answer is Rob asked me to, and he promised a distinguished audience, and he certainly delivered that. He promised a very good and interesting speech from our speaker. And so I foolishly agreed to try to do kind of NFL instant replay, which doesn't really lend itself to this format. But I'm going to try to hit some highlights of the things that I thought he said and one particular thing he didn't say, and talk about that, and then raise a question or two, and then quickly turn it over to Mark for a much more in-depth analysis about what the Admiral has said. It's interesting that I think the very fact that Admiral Mullen was on John Stewart last night, is here today, is all around town in many aspects right now, tells us about the emphasis that this administration, not just Admiral Mullen, but this administration, and particularly this White House, puts on communication, and on something they call at the White House strategic communication. The fact that Admiral Mullen was on John Stewart last night speaking to a core part of the Obama constituency, 19 to 25-year-olds, I think is both exemplary, it's laudatory, but it also tells us a little bit about how communications by this administration, the communication policy is shaped, which is very much directed back into the United States, back into trying to keep the public with the administration in a very difficult moment, not only because of the world economy and the American economy, but because of having to fight two wars, one of which the President denounced, one of which the President described as the right war at the right time and the right place. So I think we're very aware of the administration's addressing a target audience through foreign policy. And all administrations do that. This one does it perhaps with more skill and certainly with more concentration than past administrations have. But I think it raises one of the questions I want to try to deal with very briefly here a little bit, is whether or not that is all to the good, whether or not there are any cost to the kind of obsessive would probably be too strong a word, but not totally wrong word of shaping American public opinion to support the administration and to support the President. Again, all administrations do it. This one does it more than most, I do believe. In listening to the Admiral, I was also struck by him describing what was his 14th trip to Pakistan. That's a lot. I wonder if there are consequences to the kind of diplomacy by travel that we saw undertaken to some extent in Vietnam. I know the Admiral in particular would hate that kind of analogy, but if you'll remember those long trips, the frequent visits by Bob McNamara and others, the jet lag among other things. But in Pakistan it also has a particular meaning when the chairman shows up 14 times and deals by and large with the Pakistani military, and deals with the Pakistani military on the basis of we have to build up a new trust relationship in military-to-military relations. At a time when there is a relatively weak civilian government trying to get its feet on the ground, I think in many ways, much to my surprise, trying to do the right thing to a great extent. Whether or not it's possible that this form of frequent visitation with a soothing message perhaps for the Pakistani military leadership really contributes to the solidarity and the political decisions that have to be made there. As I say, I put it as a question and not as a fact. Obviously, Admiral Mullen's remarks here today demonstrate that this administration has gone to great lengths to recruit and to keep a talented and experienced, dedicated and focused national security and foreign policy team. my remarks don't really reflect a feeling of any lack of confidence in this team. I think it's a good team. I think they're doing a remarkable job in very difficult circumstances. But partly because I wouldn't want Rob to be disappointed in not having a little bit of a conflictual atmosphere around the meeting, I did want to raise that question, and then to go on to what I thought was a bifurcated presentation. I thought on Iraq and on Pakistan, and to a lesser extent, but still on Afghanistan as well, you heard the administration's fairly clearly formed and clearly stated views about what they think of the problem and what the policies are and where we're going. That was not true on Iran. I thought the Admiral's remarks on Iran were remarkably void of content. He is a military man, and it's obvious that he doesn't want to tip his hand militarily, and indeed has not been asked to do so. Rob's question did draw from him a fairly candid description, but at the end of the day, it still didn't match what he had to say on the other trouble spots. And I think that does reflect a lack of a clear policy within the administration on Iran about what to do other than to play for time. Fortunately, the Admiral did point to the danger that playing for time on Iran represents. So there is that awareness there. So that was the main thing that I didn't hear discussed in terms of his own subjects and in terms of the questions that were put to him. Let me just conclude by trying to be a little clearer, and perhaps we can go into it in questions and answers if you want to, on my concern about the cost of the emphasis on strategic communications, on communications that frequently seem to me not to deal with the elements of actual policy formulation. Let me try to be a little clearer on that. This administration's top priority from day one was to change the U.S. image in the world, all to the good. It was needed, and they've done something of a good job in doing that. But if you look at it today and ask yourself, in policy terms, what remains from the Cairo speech, the Ankara speech? How does it translate into combating al-Qaeda's cynical exploitation of the Palestinian issue? How does it relate to detecting a Nigerian training in Yemen to try to bomb an airliner going to Detroit? And most importantly, what does it mean in terms of the sacrifices that the Israelis and the Arabs both have to make if we're to get a real peace process started again? I'm not sure I can trace that line very specifically.